Hello and welcome to the channel. Hope you enjoy. This is What If Deku Had Decay Part 3 Chapter 8, New Horizons Summary. Izuku catches up with Uraraka a week after the exam, and comes to appreciate the effect that her enthusiasm is having on him. Notes, chapter text. Izuku walked down the street, picking at his gloves nervously. He'd picked up the habit a few years prior and had just never gotten rid of it, no matter how hard he tried. Izuku had started picking at his gloves when he'd gotten his first pair when he was 10. He'd been trained by a quirk specialist when he'd first gotten his power in order to always keep one finger off of whatever he was touching so that it didn't disintegrate, but Izuku had been paranoid that he'd accidentally do a repeat of kindergarten. Bakugo bullied him enough. Izuku didn't need quirk incontinence added to his ammo. He was walking toward the spot that Uraraka had asked him to meet her at. Apparently, she'd gotten in. That was wonderful. It meant they'd be going to school together. It was nice that Uraraka already felt comfortable enough to call him a friend, but now he'd have a friend that was at his school? That was just too much for Izuku's frazzled brain to handle. So, he walked dumbly down the road toward the small market that stood a few blocks from his house, and apparently a short walk from Uraraka's. That meant that they lived relatively close to each other. Would she ask him over? That would be mortifying. Izuku would be lying if he said the idea wasn't enchanting, though. That was too much, though. They just met each other a week and a half ago. Then again, it wasn't as if Izuku had a normal view of friendships, considering he'd never really had one, and even if he could stretch the definition to include his brief admiration of Bakugo back when he was 4, he hadn't properly had a positive relationship with someone his own age for 11 years. Izuku didn't really know what he was talking about. Was going over to each other's houses too much for a second meetup, or was it casual? He really didn't know. All that worry melted away, though, when Izuku spotted Uraraka's brown head of hair standing out against the gray of the wall she was standing near. Her roaming eyes seemed to immediately meet his, and Uraraka waved at him with a wide smile on her face. Izuku felt his cheeks heat up at that smile. She was really so happy to see him? Taking a few deep breaths to calm himself down, Izuku began to make his way over to Uraraka, meeting up with her at the corner of the market that she'd settled into. Midoriya, hey. How've you been? Uraraka asked. Not great. Kinda nervous about my results, Izuku admitted, the truth slipping out before he had a chance to think of a lie. Why's that? I'm sure you did great. Uraraka cheered. She pumped her fist in the air in excitement, making Izuku stifle a chuckle. Izuku had a choice to make. He could have lied, said that his letter was late and that he wasn't sure that he'd gotten in. The problem with that was that Izuku couldn't lie to save his life. He'd never succeeded once. So, Izuku sighed and took a deep breath, preparing to tell the truth. Yeah, that's sort of the problem. I'm not totally sure that whoever my teacher ends up being will be as accepting of my quirk as you were. UA prides itself on letting anyone apply to their hero course, but I think we all know who can actually get in. You saw what the exam was, and what the rules about interference with other applicants were. Applicants weren't allowed to use their quirks on other applicants. That's shorthand for quirks that only work on people are screwed. We're just lucky that neither of us have that kind of quirk. Someone that can buff their allies, though, while having tremendous potential and heroics, would fail from the start. Rescue points were a thing, so I'm not exactly sure how that sort of thing would be counted, but I'm willing to bet it's not the same thing in the eyes of the judges, Izuku explained. Oh, my gosh. I never thought about it like that. It does seem kind of unfair when you put it like that, though. Do you really think there'd be someone like that at UA? Uraraka said, furrowing her eyebrows in worry. She was looking at Izuku with not pity, but something else. Something genuine, not the look of every teacher he'd ever had. I don't know. Maybe. I won't be sure until school starts. What about you, any worries? Izuku said, pushing the focus away from himself. Uraraka's smile, previously genuine, had changed to a strained, awkward smile when Izuku had started talking about the unfairness of the system UA had in place. He felt bad that he'd pushed such a thing onto her like that and made her stop smiling, but that false smile had nothing on Uraraka's frown. It felt like he'd kicked a puppy, but Izuku barely had time to pick up on it because she reverted back to her fake smile, as if she'd broken character momentarily and was now back. Izuku felt his eyebrows draw together at that, and looked at her as she shakily breathed to speak. "I'm fine. I'll be away from my parents, which won't be fun, but I'll be at UA. It's been my dream to be a hero since I was young, and now I'm finally getting there. My parents and I have lived in Mia for as long as I remember, and I can't exactly go there and back every day, so I'm getting used to not seeing them every day now. It's lonely. But I'll be fine. I always am. I just have to smile and think of the future, when I can see them." Uraraka confessed, seemingly injecting some fake pep back into her voice toward the end. Izuku grimaced at this admission. It didn't seem like Uraraka was happy living the way she was. Izuku wished he didn't understand that. Life had other plans for him though, and Izuku could relate all too well to living a lonely life. His heart went out to Uraraka, and Izuku just wished that there was something he could do to alleviate that pain in her heart. At that moment, Izuku had an idea, but it would take guts on his part. It'd be bold, but if Uraraka accepted, it would benefit them both. Izuku swallowed down his anxiety and breathed a shaky breath. "Well, I have a lot of free time. What do you say I show you around Mizudafu before the school year starts?" Izuku offered. He hated how his voice shook, but didn't let it show on his face. It seemed like Uraraka had been slapped by the question, her shoulders rising and her breath halting. She looked into Izuku's eyes, and he tried to send her good vibes, stuff like confidence and all that, but he really wasn't feeling any of that. Instead, all he put out was probably a mess of nerves, shame and embarrassment. But Izuku could see the look in her eyes. She was thinking, likely considering his offer. He really hoped she'd take it, not only because he needed a friend, but because Izuku knew that Uraraka was in the same boat. "I'd like that," she said, the pink of her cheeks turning a deep red for a moment. "Good. Speaking of the school year, you got in. Congratulations," Izuku said. "I know, right? What class did you get?" Uraraka cheered. "1A, you?" Izuku asked, Uraraka's enthusiasm spreading to him in the form of a wide smile that he couldn't contain. "1A. We're gonna be classmates, that's so cool," Uraraka exclaimed, pumping her fists like before, yet more intense somehow. "Yeah. I can't wait," Izuku said, his energy dimming slightly as his trepidation at the thought of his teacher returned. It seemed that Uraraka noticed this and stopped her celebration. "Hey, don't worry about it. I'm sure that whoever our teacher is will be perfectly nice. He'll be kind, nurturing, and he won't be some kind of jerk who judges people for things they can't control," Uraraka said, smiling sweetly at Izuku as she spoke. "Yeah, because who at UA would judge someone based on their quirk?" A flash of his meeting with All Might a little over 10 months ago flashed through Izuku's mind, but he pushed it away. His bad blood with All Might wouldn't ruin his good time with Uraraka. They were there to have fun, and he wasn't going to drag it down with his own issues. He smiled back at Uraraka as she continued on about how they'd have the best teacher in the world, and how they'd be all these great things, and at a point, Izuku wondered if she was just talking about 13, the space hero. "So, what do you want to do now?" "We've got plenty of time till it's dark," Uraraka said. "Well, there's a few things around. The market is one, but I'm not sure if we want to hang around here." "The fish always starts getting to you after a while," Izuku replied, making a face that got Uraraka to giggle under her breath. It was a light, airy laugh that Izuku found himself smiling even wider at for some reason. "We could check out the park. Mr. Asabako should be feeding the ducks right about now. I'm sure he'd lend us some bread so that we can give it a try," he added. "Oh, I don't know. I've never fed ducks before," Uraraka said, wringing her hands together carefully so as to not make herself float away. "Don't worry, they're basically domesticated after all the years Mr. Asabako has been feeding them. He's practically raised whole generations of them," Izuku said, seeing that he'd gotten Uraraka to at least look less worried about it. That was a start. As Uraraka gave in to her desire to at least see the ducks, Izuku began heading toward the park. It was a beautiful location that was meticulously kept that way, even if the quality of the upkeep had wavered over the years. Now, though, it was a magnificent spot, and Izuku was glad to be able to show it to Uraraka in all its glory. She looked as if she'd seen an angel when she first saw it, and acted like a dazed fan meeting their idol as she walked along the paths that Izuku chose, which led them to the pond that he could already see Mr. Esabako sitting by. A feeling had crept up on Izuku during this time, though. There was a strange draw to Uraraka, a pull that Izuku couldn't quite describe. It was like he'd been missing something, and she was it. She accepted his quirk without issue, even praising it, when everyone else had been scared and treated him like he was dangerous because of it. She'd called him a friend after just one meeting. Uraraka had already treated him so well, so nicely, that he just couldn't wrap his head around the feeling that she was a kindred spirit. He sensed loneliness in her heart, and not just because of the distance from her parents. There was something else, something deeper in there that ate away at her the same way it did for Izuku. Izuku couldn't understand that. How could someone so nice, smart, and pretty be so lacking in friends? Ignoring that he just thought Uraraka was pretty, he took deep breaths to cool his face down as the two of them approached Mr. Esabako. Uraraka slowed as they got closer, as Izuku had expected. He kept walking so that he was within hearing range of the elderly Mr. Esabako. "Hello, sir," Izuku said, waving in a pronounced arc to get his attention. "Ah, young Izuku. It's been a while since I've seen you around here. How are you? And Inko?" Mr. Esabako asked, shakily gesturing for Izuku to sit beside him, which she did. "Mom's alright, and so am I. I've been getting ready for high school," Izuku said. "High school already, eh? I could have sworn you were saying the same about middle school the last time we talked," Mr. Esabako said with a deep belly laugh. Izuku used to come to the park to do some light exercise after school. Mom had banned him from doing any intensive workouts, like lifting weights, until he was at least 15, UA be damned, so he'd had to abide by that rule. That had meant that he'd worked as hard as he could to become as athletic as possible for a young boy to be. He'd used the winding paths of the park as laps, and worked on getting himself to beat his records as fast as he could. That's how he'd met Mr. Esabako, when he'd taken a break one day and actually looked around for once to notice how great the park was. Mr. Esabako had asked him to sit with him, and had given him some pretty good advice about pacing himself, which Izuku had appreciated. In the years since then, they'd developed a kind of rapport with each other. They weren't friends, per se, but they had a dynamic. Izuku didn't tell him what his quirk was, describing it in vague terms so that it could be inferred but not stated, but Mr. Esabako never tried to pry or anything, which Izuku was glad for. "So, what have you come to an old man for, I can see you've got a lady friend with you," Mr. Esabako said, keeping his voice low toward the end. Haha. That's not what you think. I suggested feeding the ducks, and she's never fed them before, so... Izuku trailed off, barely having gotten through his coherent sentences, let alone able to attempt more. Mr. Esabako slowly moved his hand over to Izuku, dragging the bag containing the chunks of bread he fed the ducks. Izuku carefully took it in his hands, letting Mr. Esabako rest his hands. He knew that the man had trouble with his motor skills more and more as he got older, and that he'd probably have to stop coming out here soon. Izuku knew how much Mr. Esabako loved his hobby, and how much it pained him to be steadily declining in his ability to do so. Maybe Izuku could start doing it in his stead. That would be a nice thing to do, and maybe Uraraka would join him if he asked. Maybe it could be a thing they did together, to carry on the tradition that Mr. Esabako started so many years ago. That would be nice. Deciding that he'd thought enough for the day, Izuku stood and waved to Mr. Esabako. He walked over to Uraraka and took a piece of bread, about the size of the tip of his finger, into his grasp. Izuku got closer to the edge of the water and crouched down. He dipped his uncovered finger slightly into the water and moved it around some, drawing the attention of the group of ducks, technically called a raft. The lot of them began to paddle toward him, and Izuku turned back to Uraraka to see that she was hesitantly standing a few steps back from him, her hands clasped together nervously. "Come closer. They're not gonna hurt you or anything, Izuku said, unable to stop himself from laughing lightly. Okay, Uraraka said, stepping closer until she was next to Izuku. She hesitated for a moment more, but sucked in a big breath and crouched down to get on Izuku's level. He gave her a smile, which she shakily returned, making Izuku's face hurt with how white his smile got. Izuku looked away from her to hide how stupid he probably looked, and focused on actually feeding the ducks. He gently threw the piece in his hand into the water, letting it drop into the water with no real noise accompanying it over the slight breeze that had begun to blow. The ducks all swarmed toward the bread, but only a few got any. Izuku looked over at Uraraka, who seemed to be intently focused on the ducks now. He held out the bag to her in an offer to try it herself. Not so bad, right? Izuku asked. Yeah. Not so bad, Uraraka said, meeting his eyes for just a moment, though it seemed like much longer than that for Izuku. The two of them spent the next few hours hanging out around the park, doing the miscellaneous things that they could. It was refreshing to share this with someone, and Izuku found himself smiling wide for the first time in a long while. At the end of the day, his face hurt from smiling so much, but Izuku couldn't bring himself to complain. He'd thoroughly enjoyed his time with Uraraka, and he was sad to see it come to an end soon, but he knew that they could always meet up if they had time, which he knew they both did. Izuku was thrilled to have a new friend, but he was being caught off guard by strange thoughts, which he often couldn't completely explain. Oh, well. That was an issue for future Izuku. Present Izuku was pretty happy, which is the first time he'd really thought that in a good long while, and Uraraka was to thank. He was looking forward to his friendship with her, as well as their high school career together. It was sure to be interesting, at the very least. Chapter 9, Old Frustrations Summary, Izuku and Bakugo are called into the principal's office. Notes, chapter text Katsuki Bakugo and Izuku Midoriya, to the principal's office. Izuku immediately froze in his seat, while people eyed Bakugo warily. The two of them met eyes, Bakugo sporting a prominent frown and Izuku feeling his eyes widen. Instead of keeping that eye contact going, Izuku looked over to the teacher, who was looking at the two of them with focused eyes. He tilted his head to the side, gesturing to the door in a silent permission of absence. Izuku took a deep, shaky breath as he stood, seeing Bakugo do the same. He let Bakugo walk in front of him, knowing that was a good way to not immediately get hit in the face. The two of them made their way down the hall, winding around corners and climbing one flight of stairs to reach the office they'd rarely seen the inside of. Izuku was silent the whole time, wondering if Bakugo would lash out at him if they managed to wind up alone. He'd been pretty okay lately, soaking up the praise from everyone around him before he'd even gotten the word of his acceptance. This was probably what this was about, anyway, so he was about to hear all about it either way. To calm himself down from the nerves that were slowly building inside, Izuku thought back to his meetup with Uraraka. He remembered how happy he'd been in those moments, the smile that had split his face and the way his cheeks had hurt at the end of the day. It brought a kind of balancing force into his chaotic mind, and allowed him to level out as the two boys approached the principal's office. Bakugo barged through the door, leaving it for Izuku to close as he walked through it like a normal person. Izuku sat down in the seat next to Bakugo, across from the principal. He looked at them, poorly masking his less than enthusiastic attitude toward Izuku. He showed open admiration of Bakugo, but when it came to Izuku, there was nothing but disdain there. Izuku had been on the receiving end of this before, but he was used to it. Bakugo, Midoriya, welcome. I trust you know what this is about? Mr. Tanaka said, leaning forward in his chair and smiling brightly. I got into UA and Deku didn't. It's obvious, Bakugo said, smirking devilishly. We both got in, Izuku said, slightly after Bakugo's declaration. Bakugo snapped his eyes over to Izuku, but he kept his own focused on Mr. Tanaka. By the look on his face, a kind of strained grin and wide, nervous eyes, the principal wasn't sure how the news would be taken by his star student. Izuku just kept his eyes forward, not giving Bakugo the satisfaction. That's right. The two of you passed UA's entrance exam. How'd you know Bakugo passed, Midoriya? Mr. Tanaka said, turning to Izuku. Don't you know?
It's the talk of the town. Katsuki Bakugo, a UA student, Izuku said, not even trying to hide the bitterness of his tone. Alright, well. The fact remains that the two of you need to submit specification forms for potential costuming and gadget designs, and, Mr. Tanaka started. Hold on. You're not serious about Deku getting in, are you? That's impossible. They would have turned him away. Bakugo yelled, gripping the arms of his chair in anger. Izuku held his breath. It was better to be as quiet as possible during these outbursts, to not draw Bakugo's ire. It was a cowardly tactic, and he wasn't proud of it, but it had saved Izuku from a beating too many times for him not to trust it. UA has a universal application policy. They accept all applications, no matter the source, Mr. Tanaka said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. I know that. I mean that they'd fail him because of his villain's quirk. Bakugo shouted, making Izuku exhale shakily despite his efforts. Well, it seems like UA has made some kind of exception. Midoriya has been accepted to the hero course, Mr. Tanaka confirmed. How am I just hearing about this now? Why haven't you been throwing it in my face all week, Deku? It's what you've always bitched and moaned about, Bakugo asked, turning his sharp, angry eyes on Izuku. I don't need your validation. It's enough for me that I got in, despite your efforts, Izuku said, still keeping himself focused on the principal. Is this all you needed us for? He asked. The principal seemed like he was scrambling for words. He looked between Izuku and Bakugo, seemingly thinking of anything to say to them that could get them to stay in the same room together, but Izuku was done with this. He didn't need the blonde's attitude. Eventually, Mr. Tanaka settled for nodding with a defeated sigh, letting Izuku know for sure what he'd already suspected. He wasn't needed here. Then, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna leave. Bakugo can collect any necessary paperwork now, and I can come when classes end later. Good day, sir, Izuku said, bowing to his principal. Izuku turned around and walked out of the room. He began striding down the hall, working his way through the school as he took deep, calming breaths. At least, that was what Izuku was trying to do, as he couldn't help but feel like there was a burning in his chest that made his whole body ache. It made Izuku's skin crawl how basic Bakugo's misunderstanding of him was. It was like he was living in a completely different reality, where Izuku really was all the things that Bakugo said he was. Maybe he did believe that Izuku was this petty person who just wanted to be a hero so that he could use his power however he wanted and not face consequences. Izuku actually laughed at that thought, because it fit Bakugo himself to a T. Accusations, a narcissist's confession. Making his way down to his locker, Izuku felt his fingers curl inward, unintentionally making a fist. As he walked, his gloves felt looser and looser, and Izuku finally checked them as he pushed open the door to find them mostly decimated. They were just rags on his hands now, and Izuku quickly pressed his thumbs into his palms to keep himself from touching things with all 5 fingers. He must have accidentally pressed all 5 fingers to his gloves when he'd made a fist, and Izuku suddenly realized a major flaw in the design, that being the possibility of this accident happening. He'd have to start cutting holes in the palms as well. After the accident with his gloves, Izuku began to rush toward his locker. He got there in a moment, having already reached the area, and carefully opened the locker to find a pair of new gloves already waiting for him hanging out of his bag. Izuku always left them like that in case accidents like this happened, though they didn't happen often. Izuku disregarded the gloves for now, needing to release some stress. A few years prior, Izuku had thought of a way to vent any frustrations he'd have while not risking his quirk hurting anyone. It involved the removal of his gloves and a few baseballs. Izuku delicately removed 4 baseballs from his bag, which were pretty much always in there, and slid them into his pockets. The fire was still raging inside him, and it was all he could do to keep himself from screaming. Izuku made his way out into the open area of the schoolyard. He then took one of the baseballs out of his pocket and slowly placed all 5 fingers on it. Once his final finger was laid on it, Izuku threw the ball as hard as he could in a random direction. He put all of his strength into it, venting all of his negative feelings at that moment into the powerful throw. It would have gone out over the face and into the street if it didn't turn to dust by the apex of its flight.
Izuku watched as the ball left a trail of dust behind it before deteriorating to ash completely, dissipating through the air as it slowed down as a thin wispy trail of dust in the air. He proceeded to do the same with the other balls until there were none left, punctuating his final throw with a ragged scream that was forced out by the effort of the throw. He stayed there for a moment, breathing hard after the release of anger and frustration he felt. Izuku didn't need this. He didn't deserve all this hate. It was like there was something clawing at him from within sometimes, and it was just begging to get out. Izuku needed to contain all that negativity, and this was a tool to do that. He knew he needed to get better at it before UA's school year started, but he'd cross that bridge when he got to it. All he needed to do now was wait. Notes, this one's a little shorter, but I couldn't stretch it out to about 3K, which is the rough word count of the other chapters. That's why I decided to change around the upload schedule with it. Hope you enjoyed, though. See ya in another 2 days. Chapter 10, Impressions. Today was the day. It was finally time for Izuku to start school at UA. He stood in the hall leading to the front door of his and Inko's little apartment. He couldn't move. If he went outside, with his UA uniform on, he'd be announcing to the world who he was. His intentions, his goals, his hopes. Everything would be laid bare. Everyone around there knew who he was, and what had happened. It would be like pointing in the face of God and saying suck it. Izuku wasn't sure that he was ready. He knew that he needed to get to UA before classes started, because he was not going to have his first impression on his new peers, and his teacher especially, be tardiness of all things. But, he froze up whenever he thought of taking that single step over the threshold. Izuku? Inko asked from behind. He turned around to face her, trying to keep his face neutral but failing miserably by the look of understanding that flashed in her eyes. Nervous, huh? She asked again. Yeah. It's stupid, but I'm scared, Izuku said, his voice breaking pitifully. It's not stupid. Izuku, it's fine to be scared. What matters is how you react to that. What's that saying you like again? Inko said, approaching Izuku and trying one last time to get his tie to look presentable. He swore that it was some kind of trap that he just couldn't figure out, even with the dexterity in his fingers that his quirk training lent him. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear, Izuku sighed. He didn't necessarily hold All Might in the same light as he once did, but he'd done a lot to preserve that famous saying in the modern age. He couldn't fault him there. Right. Fear is what makes us human, and you are very much human, despite what those bullies say. You just have to do your best, and nobody will be able to deny that you deserve your place among those future heroes. Show him what you've got, Izuku. Inko said. Izuku felt his eyes begin to sting, and allowed himself a shaky smile. He was immensely grateful for his mother's support, and it was moments like these when he realized just how much he had at home. Hisashi Midoriya was a sore spot, but they'd been able to build something better, without him around. It didn't matter what they'd been through, because they'd done it together and could face anything as long as they maintained their trust and love. Izuku wiped the tears from his eyes, the soft texture of his gloves rubbing against his skin, and let out a soft, choked laugh. I will. Thank you, for everything. I couldn't have gotten to this point without you, Izuku said, putting his hand over hers once she stopped fiddling with the tie. You don't have to thank me, silly. It's what any mother would do. I love you, don't forget that when you're some big-shot hero on the news, Inko said. Never. I love you, too, Izuku said. He quickly pulled Inko in for a tight hug, holding his mother in his arms for a brief moment with all his strength. Inko hugged him in return, and the two shared that moment as they stood in the hall together. When Izuku pulled away, he knew it was time for him to go. He took a deep breath, turning toward the door. This was going to be the bravest thing he'd done yet. It was easy to act, to do something behind a veil of anonymity. Vigilantes proved that by simply existing. That was the easy part. The hard part was accepting the consequences, good and bad, of those actions. What was hard was facing the world after acting and saying that was me. That was what Izuku was about to do, and he was finally ready. Izuku left with his head held high.
He walked down the pavement toward the train station with his gait strong and even, his back straight and his muscles relaxed. Izuku couldn't remember the last time he was this relaxed before a first day at school, but he was ready to get his career at UA started. It was what he'd been waiting for, training for, living for years. This was it, the day it all started. Years from now, Izuku would look back at this day as when it all came together and things finally started going right. He had to believe that, or else he'd think about everything that could go wrong. But, he was determined to keep his mind on the positives, such as Uraraka being in his class. That was going to be good. Great, even. She was the first real friend Izuku had ever made, and it sent a steady buzz throughout his nervous system at the thought of spending even more time with her. Not in a weird way, of course, it just felt good to have a friend who actually thought of him as a friend in return. His relationship with Bakugo had deteriorated so fast once Izuku's quirk came in that he'd become uncertain about if they were ever really friends, but Izuku had come to the conclusion that it was a mix of Bakugo's fears about Izuku's power and the prejudice against those with villain quirks that had caused the breakdown of their relationship. Of course, the whole notion of a villain quirk was absurd propaganda meant to belittle and marginalize those with powers that may be a little unsightly or unusual, like decimation, but it was still a truth in the public eye. But, Izuku was done thinking about all that nonsense for now. He needed to keep his eye on the prize, enjoying his time at UA. That would be easier said than done, but Izuku would manage. That thought carried him all the way from the train station to the front door of the classroom, marked with a large 1A that stretched the whole length of the door, which was at least 4 meters tall. Izuku looked up at it with wide eyes, but snapped himself out of it and rolled the door to the side, stepping into the room without any further hesitation. Immediately, there was shouting. One of the voices was familiar, belonging to the only Katsuki Bakugo. The other went to a tall, clearly muscular young man standing over Bakugo, who sat at his desk, and pointing at him with all 5 fingers in an oddly straight line going from his shoulder to the tip of his longest finger. Izuku immediately locked eyes with Bakugo, who narrowed his own at Izuku in return, but he immediately let a small smirk spread on his face and looked away from Bakugo, who made a quiet, small noise at the sight of Izuku not acknowledging him. What a tool! Izuku walked right past Bakugo, who was still trying to get the shorter boy's attention like some kind of needy child, and sat down in his own seat, which was, regretfully, directly behind Bakugo's. There really needed to be something good about this classroom soon if Izuku was going to tolerate having Bakugo right in front of him during every second of class time. Speaking of the devil, or maybe angel was a more apt description, that was when Uraraka walked through the door, pausing when she took in the tense feeling left in Izuku's wake as he brushed Bakugo off. Uraraka immediately met Izuku's eyes, and he felt his lips stretch into a bright smile, which she returned with her own. The two of them kept at it for a moment, but Izuku snapped out of it when the boy who'd been trying to talk at Bakugo looked at him and stood over Izuku in a similar fashion. Hello. My name is Tenya Ida. Who might you be? The boy, apparently named Ida, asked. Izuku Midoriya. Pleased to meet you, Izuku said, holding a gloved hand up to shake Ida's. Are gloves part of the school's dress code? I don't recall them being on the list, Ida said, furrowing his brow at Izuku. I don't recall any rules against them, so why not? Even if there were, there are some extenuating circumstances in my case, Izuku said, putting on a smile. Very well. I look forward to learning with you, Ida said, bowing deeply to Izuku. I do, too, Izuku said, keeping himself from frowning slightly. This guy was way too formal. He had a very strong rich kid aura going, but Izuku wasn't going to comment on it. He'd let Ida be. Izuku watched as Ida walked over to start his introduction over again with Uraraka, who'd made her way to a seat on the other side of the room from Izuku. He didn't know why that stung the way it did, but Izuku could think about that later. For now, he may as well get acquainted with the people around his seat that weren't Bakugo, so he turned around and looked back to see a tall, pretty girl with the coolest ponytail Izuku had ever seen, a boy with a nasty-looking scar on his face and dual-colored hair, another boy with a bird's head, the boy sitting next to himself that wore a very wide grin, and a girl with short, spiky purple hair and what looked like audio plugs coming out of her earlobes. The short boy who he'd spoken with before the entrance exam, Mineta if Izuku recalled correctly, recognized him with a small chuckle. What's up, man? Good to see you passed, Mineta said with his prominent lisp. Thanks, you too. I knew your quirk would be right for the hero course, Izuku said. Right, thanks for that. You really gave me the boost I needed to pull myself together back then. I'm not sure I would have made it in without your pep talk, Mineta said, sighing at his own attitude before the two had conversed. Nah, I'm sure that you would have gotten in. The entrance exam has such a vaguely stated goal and is really biased toward quirks that can destroy or capture targets, and yours falls into that second category. You were almost made for it, Izuku said. Ha! If you say so. Hey, I saw the way that brunette chick was eyeing you. You're onto it already, yeah? Mineta said, his eyes narrowing and his tone becoming a little more suggestive, if Izuku was to give it a name. Izuku felt himself lean away from Mineta in surprise. He had no clue what he was talking about. Onto it? Call Izuku a square, but that meant nothing to him, and he had no problem expressing this. How do you mean, he asked. The girl. You've gotta be putting it on real thick if she's already looking at you like that. You got her quick, Mineta explained, grinning lecherously. Izuku felt a scowl form on his lips. It kind of sounded like Mineta was implying that Izuku was some sort of player, just interested in Uraraka for superficial reasons. It felt like a slap in the face to be misunderstood on that level. They were friends, that was it, so what gave Mineta the idea that he'd do that? What even prompted this? A moment of eye contact? It was kind of ridiculous. He caught the girl behind Mineta, the one with the cool ponytail, looking at him with a strange expression on her face. It was like she was studying him, looking for something. I think you've misunderstood me and my intentions on the most fundamental level that is possible. I don't know why you're here, Mineta, but I'm here to be a hero. I don't have time to waste on things like that. I'm willing to give you the benefit of the doubt, because you obviously had to pass a written and practical test to be here, meaning you earned your place. It would be naive to think, however, that you can simply say what you want and not face consequences, even in a place like this. Especially in a place like this, Izuku said, trying to puzzle out exactly what it meant that his hands shook at the implications of Mineta's words. What the hell, man? I was just saying that the chick's hot and you've clearly got her wrapped around your finger. You should be happy, it's a compliment, Mineta said, his tone pleading. Izuku saw the girl with the ponytail flinch at that last part. The classroom was eerily quiet. The scarred boy was looking at Mineta with a passive, yet powerful expression on his face. The boy beside Izuku, with the large grin, now absent, was staring straight ahead with wide eyes. Izuku himself felt that shake in his hands return, a hauntingly familiar pressure on his hands making them coil into fists. He got a flash of a memory, of this same feeling welling up inside him. His hands were smaller, younger. It hurt, how much pressure was pulsing through his hands. It felt like the time Izuku had lifted the couch so that Inko could clean under it. His hands had throbbed from the strain afterward, and this was similar except dialed up by 1000%. It was impossibly painful, and Izuku managed to keep his mouth shut as he held his hands close to his chest. He could feel Bakuba's burning gaze on him as the blonde turned around and stared at Izuku's hands, all the anger in his expression gone. Did Bakugo know what was happening? Had this happened before? It had, hadn't it? This was it, what had happened that day, when this quirk had first awakened. Izuku knew that that was what this was, this pressure from within him, but he didn't know how to make it go away. Or maybe he did. At that thought, the memory of Red took him over, and Izuku felt his hands close in on themselves harder than he'd ever managed before. You're all ready to learn. Not like the last batch. Excellent, a voice from the front of the class said. Everybody broke out of their silence spectating to snap their attention to the man now standing at the front podium. Izuku felt himself return to his body, his head feeling light for some reason. He looked around, seeing Uraraka looking at him with wide eyes. As Izuku breathed in deeply, he turned back to the front of the class, and the man keeping his body angled toward him even when his face turned to the other side of the room. That was weird, but Izuku ignored it to focus on his breathing. Good morning. I'm show you to Aizawa, your homeroom teacher.
Because we've wasted no time on frivolities, we can get started. These are your gym uniforms, the homeless-looking man said, pulling out 20 sets of shirts and pants styled with UA's letters on them out of the yellow bag he dragged in behind him. Put them on and meet me at the athletics field in 15 minutes, he continued.
Aizawa was strikingly familiar to Izuku.
He must have been a hero, since he taught hero course kids at UA, but Izuku couldn't tell from where he'd seen Aizawa.
He'd probably figure it out with more exposure to the man, but that could wait.
First, he needed to get through whatever Aizawa had in store for the class at the athletics field and make sure that he didn't have any other moments like his small. The closest thing that Izuku had to a frame of reference for it was a panic attack, but it was different than that.
He'd figure it out later, though.
Now, he had to get changed. Chapter 11, Quirk Apprehension Summary. Izuku's first test at UA begins, leaving him with mixed feelings. Chapter text. As Izuku stepped out onto the athletics field, he was well aware that Bakugo was staring at him. He'd noted that Bakugo seemed to be keeping his distance from Izuku, which wasn't anything new, but the way he'd send the smaller boy glances every time he moved his hands for something would send shivers down Izuku's spine, and he didn't know why. Well, he knew exactly why, because he'd begun shaking and freaking out like a weirdo before class had even started, but Bakugo usually had an air of confidence, even when he was acting on fear. It was strange to see Bakugo do anything fearfully, but the not-so-subtle glances whenever Izuku moved his hands were definitely ticking all the boxes. He couldn't focus on that, though. Izuku walked across the grass toward where the teacher, apparently called Aizawa, was waiting for the class. He was preceded by Bakugo by minutes, but Mineta, oddly, hung at his side like a dog who'd been spooked by a loud noise. He guessed it had something to do with how the girls would throw dirty looks when the smaller boy looked over at them, but Izuku wasn't sure about that. He didn't know what Mineta had done and said before he'd arrived, and he wasn't sure he wanted to if it had garnered such an immediate dislike for him as a result. Izuku approached the gathering of students and hung back, not wanting to be at the front of any crowd after his small spike of panic earlier. His hands still ached, but it was more manageable now. He tuned into what Aizawa was saying to the group, as all the others had. "We're going to be conducting a test of your quirks," the teacher said, making Izuku's stomach drop. He continued, "You'll go through 7 tests of your physical abilities, supplemented by your quirks in whichever way you see fit. Do whatever it takes to get the highest score possible. Go beyond." "Alright, sounds like fun," a pink-skinned girl exclaimed, agreeing with the general air of excitement that was quickly spreading throughout the crowd of students.
"Oh, you think this is a game? Fine, then whoever comes in last place will be expelled."
"How's that for fun?"
Aizawa added. A murmur broke out across the class. This was what they were doing instead of orientation?
Izuku frowned, having confirmed for himself that this would suck right out of the gate. He thought UA's patented subversive, alternative teaching style would amount to petty hazing, but school hadn't even officially started yet and they were already on a whole other level with it. Looking around, Izuku could spot 4 other people with seemingly non-power-up type quirks that would automatically score in the bottom 5, and Izuku included himself into that, so 5. Before this test had even begun, he could pinpoint who was going to fail, and he felt a hot flash of anger streak through him. Before he knew it, he was talking.
"That's unfair," he said. "Unfair? You don't know what unfair is, kid." "Not until you see," Aizawa tried to say, "avoidable deaths?"
Izuku asked, not allowing himself to waver when the class parted to give him line of sight with Aizawa. It looked like something flashed in his eyes for a moment, but his stoic mask was put back on with haste.
"Until you see the spilling of blood that was entirely preventable? Until you see red when you close your eyes? I know what unfairness is, and I'm looking it in the eye right now. Midoriya, no, listen to me.
That girl over there, the invisible one, you've said to use our quirks however we can to score high on these physical tests, but how is being invisible going to help her run faster?"
Izuku asked, only frowning deeper when Aizawa did not answer.
"You, with the earlobes, what's your quirk?" A shorter, purple-haired girl with long, hanging mutations shaped like the jack to a pair of headphones startled and flushed at being called out. She was silent for a moment, but then spoke up with, I can hear from far away and detect vibrations."
How will that help you lift up a piece of heavy rock or metal? Izuku asked again. It won't, the girl said back. Yeah. Izuku said, feeling more confident now that he was on a roll. He pointed out the tall, well-built boy with a spiky mutation atop his head. What can you do? I can talk to animals, the boy said in a quiet, strained voice. What will you do when you need to clear a gap to save a hostage? Izuku asked. The boy went quiet. Izuku wasn't surprised. He looked back at Aizawa, who looked angry enough, with his prominent scowl and furrowed brow, that it seemed his eyes were glowing red. Actually, they were glowing red, and his hair was sticking straight up somehow. Izuku suddenly felt like a weight was lifted off his shoulders, like he was able to breathe again, and it came to him when his hands stopped aching. This was Shoyuta Aizawa, the erasure hero. Eraserhead. This was one of the best heroes in the underground scene, and Izuku had been shit-talking him to his face. Holy crap. Are you done? Aizawa asked, looking Izuku dead in the eyes with his own shimmering ones. Yeah, that about sums up my problem, Izuku said, suddenly feeling as though his throat was very dry. Good. If you don't like how I teach my class, you don't have to sit through it. Have a problem? Leave, and don't come back. It's no skin off my back if you can't handle putting in a little effort, Aizawa said, slowly stepping toward Izuku as he spoke, eventually coming to stand directly over him. Izuku saw red. Effort? Effort? Do you have any idea what my quirk did? Izuku asked, keeping his voice low even if everyone heard him anyway. Your quirk breaks down matter at a molecular, not what it does. What it did, he said, slower this time. Aizawa looked into Izuku's eyes, clearly trying to figure out what he meant. Izuku tried to put everything into the way he looked at the man, every ounce of grief and pain that he'd had to suffer through in the years after his quirk's first activation. Clearly, the great Eraserhead wasn't a people person, because he simply sighed and released his quirk, which must have been solely for the intimidation factor, since Izuku's hadn't been anywhere close to using his quirk. He can't say it didn't work, but it was still overkill at best. I'll do your tests, Izuku said. Aizawa narrowed his eyes at Izuku, and he could have sworn that the teacher's hand twitched upward, but he calmed down soon enough. Aizawa walked back over to the front of the group as his hair fell around his head and back into its messy clump around his shoulders. There was a moment of silence from the class as they feared the wrath of a man who would threaten expulsion as a casual punishment. What would he do to a kid who so clearly challenged his authority on the first day? There were a few people looking at Izuku, including Uraraka, Mineta and Bakugo, who snapped their gazes to the front as soon as he looked their way. Uraraka lingered a little longer, but reluctantly turned away from Izuku when he gestured vaguely for her to do so, even though it kind of hurt to tell his new friend not to worry about it. If there aren't any further interruptions, we'll start with the ball throw. Midoriya, you placed first on the practical exam, Aizawa said, tossing Izuku a ball he almost didn't catch. Throw it as hard as you can, using your quirk, without leaving the circle. Izuku, ball in hand, walked over to the pitcher's mound in the middle of the field. He stood in the circle, thinking about how he could use his quirk to get a higher result in this test. Ignoring the small sound of outrage that came from Bakugo at the confirmation that he'd been first in the entrance exam, Izuku almost felt the gears turning in his head. His mind recalled his way to blow off steam, the way in which he'd decimate balls while throwing them so that they turned to dust in the air. If Izuku could use his quirk in a way that altered the ball's shape and aerodynamics, then he could probably get it to fly further than he could have with a plane throw. Slipping his glove off, Izuku rolled the ball in his other hand, trying to pin down the spot at which it would be best to use his quirk to achieve the result he was aiming for. Once he realized that was kind of useless, since it was a perfectly spherical ball, Izuku simply chose a spot at random and tried it. He pinched all of his fingers on his uncovered hand together and pressed down on the ball with them, making contact with it in the barest possible fashion and triggering his quirk. Izuku immediately tore his hand away, not wanting the ball to fully disintegrate, just enough. The ball caved in, a small collection of dust spilling out of a brand new cavity in it that traveled about halfway through the small sphere. That would have to be enough, as Aizawa was looking at him with an intense glare that told Izuku to get on with his throw.
Putting his glove back on, Izuku took it in his good hand.
He leaned back and tensed his arm, ready to throw, and then sent it, hurling the ball into the air with all the strength his thin limbs could muster. The ball soared through the air, hurtling away from Izuku, and he saw that its path wasn't straight. It had a kind of angle to it that veered left, as if it was being subtly pulled in that direction. Izuku figured it was because of the cavity, and saw it fall to the ground, accompanied by a beep from Aizawa's device. When Aizawa turned it around to show Izuku, he was pleasantly surprised to see a score of 57 meters, which was more than he'd been hoping for. He rejoined the class in a fairly neutral state, as he just about expected this from the get-go, but was doing well, if he could say so himself. It did really bug Izuku, however, that UA had Eraserhead teaching. That just felt like they admitted they couldn't control their students. See, Eraserhead's quirk was to inhibit the function of quirks in those he could see, and so putting him in charge of a class of rowdy teenagers learning to use their quirks felt both like a smart decision and a terrible one. It was smart, since he could easily prevent and solve problems that came up because of irresponsible quirk use, but it was also awful because quirks were part of people. They were biological functions. Nobody was giving a swimming coach the ability to stop their students from holding their breath. It was counterintuitive and took away the bodily autonomy of kids. If they wanted to prevent accidents with quirks, then they should teach the kids to use their quirks properly instead of just pushing the eraser button, and allow the kids to learn nothing. Izuku couldn't help but feel like it would encourage recklessness and a lack of proper quirk discipline. After that little show from Bakugo, they got started. The tests were all standard physical tests that Izuku had done before, though obviously not using his quirk. First up was the 50-meter dash, which he could use his quirk to help score high in, so he simply ran it. It didn't help that Bakugo was paired up with him for it, but he ignored the subtle jab at him when they both crossed the finish line. "What's your damage, Deku? I thought I made it clear that you're a fucking villain, so why are you here?" Bakugo asked. Izuku didn't give Bakugo the satisfaction of a reply. He just walked away and sat down on the ground until the next test. That was what he'd planned, but Uraraka suddenly approached him and gave him a bright smile. Izuku felt his chest tighten as she did, but he ignored that, too. "Hey! You did well on the dash," Uraraka said, sitting next to him on the ground. "Nah, my quirk can't do anything to help me here," Izuku sighed. "Yeah, mine can't either, to be honest. I can make myself a little lighter, because of my clothes, but I can't do much," she admitted. Izuku kept quiet. He didn't know how Uraraka would think of him after his outburst. Would she still want to be his friend after she'd seen him all but yell at a teacher on the first day? Would she think he was just some rude jerk who didn't actually want to be a hero? Would she think he was like Bakugo? All those thoughts swirled around his head, making him feel a little dizzy, but his worries were alleviated when Uraraka spoke up. "I'm sorry about before," she said. "What do you mean?" Izuku asked. "When Aizawa was talking about expulsion, I wanted to say something, but you did first, and it made me feel bad for not really joining in. It is unfair, what he's doing, and I'm glad you said something." "I'm just sorry I didn't back you up," Uraraka said. She looked down at her hands, which were fidgeting in her lap. "No!" Izuku shouted, and flushed at the accidental raising of his voice. "You didn't do anything wrong. If I'm being honest, I kind of regret rocking the boat so early. I was so prepared to be upset that I got all worked up right out of the gate." "But it is unfair," Uraraka said. "Yeah, but I don't think there's anything we can really do about it. The best I can really do is to get through today and hope that actual classes are better than this," Izuku said, looking over and seeing that Aizawa was gesturing for everyone to group up for the next test. As Izuku got up, he was joined by Uraraka, who put her hand on his shoulder. His heart beat hard, and he looked back at her to see that she was staring him in the eye with a serious expression on her face. Such an expression would have looked goofy on her round, cutesy face, with those seemingly permanently flushed cheeks and that gravity-defying hair, but Izuku found himself frozen by it. He forgot to breathe for a second as that moment of touch dragged on for what felt like minutes. By the end of it, Izuku regained his wits when Uraraka took her hand off his shoulder and smiled. "We'll get through it together, right?
Friends can make anything bearable, she said, making Izuku want to throw up with how his stomach was squirming. Yeah, he muttered, his voice breaking as he fought not to show Uraraka what exactly he was feeling at that moment. Izuku and Uraraka walked over to join the class once again, now moving on to the grip strength test. Trying hard to focus on his performances with these tests, Izuku didn't speak up very much after that. He simply put his head down, save for the occasional, super-normal glance at Uraraka, and did his very best, throwing in a brief use of his quirk every so often when he thought it could help and not risk anything happening. Decimation wouldn't work very well with a lot of these tests, but he could use it in the grip strength test, at least. When Izuku got his hands on the device they were using to test their grip, Izuku waited for a moment. He stood by someone else doing it, and observed how the device worked. From what Izuku could see, the device measured grip strength by measuring how far the handle was pressed inward from the default position. He also saw that it must have had some kind of crazy resistance, as one of Izuku's classmates got around 500 kilograms by wrapping 3 different hands around it and squeezing. Seeing that, Izuku stepped away from the largest clump of students and pulled one of his gloves off. He then took a closer look at the device, and pinpointed the specific mechanism that pushed against the grip, which was how it measured grip strength, by measuring how much it had to push back and working backwards from there, which seemed like a flawed design. Izuku used his quirk on it. It wasn't easy, because he had to move his fingers in a way that didn't accidentally meet the conditions of decimation on anything else, but he managed to weave his fingers far enough into it that an inner piece turned to ash and filtered out of the device with a soft hiss of moving particles. Then he clamped down on it, accidentally pushing the handle a little bit over to the side and past the back part it was supposed to hit when pushed on. With a pit in his stomach, hoping it had worked the way he'd thought, Izuku looked at the number that registered on the small screen at the top of the device, which put up an infinity symbol. Izuku laughed, a high, uncontrolled laugh, and people around him began to look at him, noticing that, from their point of view, he'd clamped down so hard that he'd broken it, which not even the boy with multiple arms had been able to do. Whoa, dude, you must have a crazy power-up quirk, a boy with red hair all but yelled with enthusiasm. Did you turn it to dust? Asked a boy with thick, rounded elbows and dark hair. How'd you get infinity? The invisible girl asked. Infinity? You have to be cheating now. Bakugo screamed from across the area. Bakugo raced across the group and ripped Izuku's device from his hands. The blonde boy looked at it for a moment and then made a small squeaking noise that Izuku took an odd amount of joy in hearing, and then dropped it. He raised his hands like he was about to blast Izuku with his quirk, but a few layers of thick fabric wrapped around him, and all that happened was a small pop of light in the palms of his hands before Aizawa cleared his throat from behind Bakugo. What the fuck? What is this shit? Bakugo screamed from under the layers, his voice muffled by the material. This is a specially made capture weapon of my own design. I'd advise you not to resist, as even if you do break out of it, I'll have you pay the reparation costs, which aren't insignificant for a unique item like this. I'm going to let you go now, and you're going to calm down, Aizawa drawled. The capture weapon, which previously was taught against Bakugo's body as it held him back from attacking Izuku, went slack, and Bakugo was free to move. He decided, with his infinite wisdom, not to try for an attack again, and moved over to the edges of the group so that he could sulk, probably. When he did, Izuku was able to see Aizawa, now blinking a red glow out of his eyes. His hair fell once more, and he returned his capture weapon to its default state, a gray scarf wrapped around his upper torso. He sighed and made eye contact with Izuku. Now what's this about infinity? He asked. It has to be a mistake. There's no way that a school focused on progression and quantitative results like UA would actually allow something to read as infinite, Izuku rambled, picking up the device for Aizawa to see. No, that's correct. You must have bypassed the measurement system entirely by, from the looks of it, completely eliminating the method with which it does so. Aizawa looked up from the device and back at Izuku. A little effort. Izuku took a shaky breath in and met Aizawa's eyes, which were as wide as his unnervingly rigid smile. It looked like he didn't know how to smile, so he just went with whatever he thought would look right, but hadn't actually ever seen a smile, so this was what he ended up with. It was a smile, though, and Izuku couldn't complain about that. Actually, yes he could, because this smile made his heart stop for a second due to the sheer shock of it. He laughed, but deep down wanted Aizawa to stop looking at him with that unhinged-looking expression. When that test was over, Izuku went with the rest of the class to the next one. On the way, Uraraka fell into step next to him with a wide smile on her face, which Izuku couldn't help but return with a small smile of his own.
You totally flipped Aizawa's whole thing on him. That was awesome.
Uraraka said, bouncing with every step she took.
Really? Izuku asked, feeling a warmth come to his cheeks. I suppose so.
I don't know if I can keep that up, though, he added. Well, I think you've impressed him either way, Uraraka said airily, as casually as someone might say what they had for lunch the day previous.
Izuku didn't think he'd ever done that before, impressed a teacher, and his head suddenly felt light at the realization. If things kept going his way like this, then maybe UA wouldn't be so bad for Izuku. Maybe he could actually look forward to the next few years. That'd be nice. Chapter 12 taught the rest of the tests weren't as noteworthy as the ball throw and the grip strength test.
Izuku couldn't really figure out a way to circumvent the whole system they used to measure results or supplement his physical abilities with his quirk during them, so he'd ended up doing them like normal for the most part. The class came to the end of their tests and grouped up once again in front of Aizawa. Izuku stood towards the back and Uraraka having made her way to his side once again, which he tried not to be too flustered by. I've got your scores all tallied up. I'm not gonna go through it all individually, so just find your score and think about what you did to deserve it, Aizawa said, tapping the screen of his device. A hologram popped up out of the device. That must have been why it looked so weird. It was made by UA. Izuku couldn't help but feel like that was another fault of the school, that they had the budget and the resources to make these incredible technologies and then they didn't share them with anyone else.
Seriously, holograms? Izuku couldn't get hung up on that now, though. He needed to find his place on this leaderboard.
He tracked down the list and saw himself at 14th place. Good, he was safe. That wasn't the position that Mineta was in, however, as he was at the bottom of the list. Izuku looked over at him and noticed as the ponytail girl a few steps away from him breathed a mostly unseen and unheard sigh of relief. Izuku wondered just what Mineta had done to make this girl so uncomfortable around him and relieved to see him go.
But, Aizawa spoke up once again.
Also, nobody's being expelled. That was just a logical ruse to get you to do your best on these tests, Aizawa said.
Are you kidding me? Izuku groaned.
There had been a brief, collective sound of joy from the class, but that all vanished when Izuku spoke. It was like he was a black hole, sucking all the energy from the class in a few simple words. He looked Aizawa in the eye again, and saw the slight smirk the teacher had been wearing fade into a small frown at being talked to in that tone again.
Do you have something to say, Midoriya? Aizawa asked. Yeah. What the hell? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Izuku shouted. A logical ruse?
No, you just lied to us for no good reason, he continued.
The reason was to scare the crap out of kids and make them fail? As heroes, we're not heroes, Izuku said. We're kids. We were in middle school a few weeks ago.
If you really wanted to get us riled up, say that the top scorers get a reward or something. Staying in this class is the reward, Aizawa cut in. Izuku could see that the man was getting genuinely annoyed now, but still pressed on.
Not much of a reward, then.
Something like a commendation at the next school ceremony, or hell, even just bragging rights would do it for most kids I know, but not the threat of immediate expulsion. We all earned our place, so what gives you the right to rip that away from us?
Izuku ranted.
He felt his heart hammering in his chest, and his face warming up as his breathing got quicker to account for his quick words. You've spoken about unfairness, but the world really is cruel, even more so to people who aren't prepared for it, Aizawa said.
So your response is to be even more cruel? Nothing gets better unless you make it better. The world is gonna come at us with all it's got, so give us a shield. Don't stab us from behind and say you're helping. Izuku yelled. He could feel the tiniest pricking of tears in the corners of his eyes. I'm not going to let someone go through years of training if they can't handle high school orientation. Both Izuku and Aizawa were silent. They stared at each other for a few moments,
the class keeping their distance from the two of them. Izuku didn't know when he'd taken those steps, but he was now directly in front of Aizawa, face to face with his teacher. That also meant that Uraraka was no longer at his side, which was slightly disheartening, but Izuku could deal with fighting this alone. He'd done it before. We're supposed to be listening to our principal welcome us to school. What if any one of us had needed to set up a schedule with a guidance counselor, or wanted to meet our peers, or do something else than be talked down to by a 30-year-old man who takes joy out of bullying children? No, you wanted to make a point that ultimately serves to lessen the amount of people who could do good as heroes, Izuku said, his voice lower and more restrained now that he was closer to Aizawa. Aizawa was silent for a few moments. He looked Izuku in the eye with a tiredness that made him unsure if it was wise to argue any further. Izuku knew that it wasn't smart to argue with a teacher in the first place, but he felt he had good reasons and solid points to make, and he'd been so ready for unfairness that he'd just leapt right into it. The expression on Aizawa's face was challenging that belief, that confidence that Izuku had had in his correctness in resisting. Aizawa faced the rest of the class without addressing Izuku. You can all go. There are syllabi on your desks in the classroom, so make sure to read them thoroughly before tomorrow. You're dismissed, Aizawa said. Izuku sighed. He turned to walk away, seeing that Uraraka was standing still, waiting for him so that they could walk together, and that totally didn't do anything to Izuku's stomach. He tried his best to smile at her, which earned him one in return, and Izuku found it just a little bit easier to force that smile at the sight of it. He took a step forward, but a strong, rigid hand came down on his shoulder to force him to the spot. Not you. I want to talk with you, Aizawa said from behind Izuku, sending a chill down his spine. Okay, Izuku said, silently shooting Uraraka a look that was hopefully apologetic. Uraraka stayed for a second, looking at Izuku with a puzzled look in her eyes, but quickly seemed to get it, as she nodded with slightly wider eyes than normal. She waved to him, still with that bright, dizzying smile on her face, and turned to leave. Izuku felt the corners of his mouth stretch as he smiled involuntarily, but that smile quickly formed into a frown when he turned around and looked Aizawa in the eye again, seeing his tired eyes peering into his own, the gray irises holding an intelligence that Izuku hadn't seen before. Do you want to tell me what's gotten you so riled up? Aizawa asked, narrowing his eyes at Izuku. Yeah. My teacher's more interested in playing mind games than doing his job, Izuku shot back. I'm doing my job. If you want to be the best you can be, this is important. Would you rather go into the school year not knowing your limits? Be totally unprepared for what this school will throw at you? Aizawa asked again. I thought that was what the entrance exam was for. Everyone in this class passed that test. They know what they're capable of, because they had to prove it barely a month ago, Izuku said. The entrance exam is flawed. It can allow people with no technique, coasting along on their natural power to get in, and this is how I determine if that's the case, Aizawa explained. The entrance exam is flawed. I agree. It targets those with non-physical, unobtrusive quirks like invisibility, or telepathy, or powering other people up, and then the rules make them unable to effectively use those powers to become heroes. How does invisibility help someone destroy a robot? Enhanced senses won't tear a metal limb to shreds. Mind control, though rare, would be invaluable for heroes to have on their side, and yet that's completely neutralized by the nature of the exam. You wouldn't pass that exam, so why expect others with esoteric quirks, or just quirks that aren't immediately and obviously destructive, to pass? Izuku ranted. Kid, I get it. I really do. I know it's unfair, and I know that my response to that unfairness comes off as just more unnecessary cruelty, but I've been a teacher for 5 years, and my way has worked every time. You'd think I'd know what I'm doing by now, Aizawa said slowly. Yeah, Izuku said, his will to argue fizzling out at last. I'm sorry. Don't be. You didn't do anything wrong, Aizawa immediately replied. Izuku looked back at Aizawa's face, and nothing about it had changed. Nothing about his tone had changed either, so that told Izuku that Aizawa was either always genuine, or never was. Riding on the small bit of hope that he'd gotten from the teacher's statement, Izuku chose to believe that, while Aizawa absolutely had and probably would lie again to his students, it was probably not wise to doubt the intention and meaning behind his words.
What do you mean? You're not mad at me or anything? I don't have detention? Izuku asked in quick bursts of breath. No.
You thought something was unfair and didn't hesitate to call it out and fight it. Even if there were miscommunications, and even if they were intentional on my part, you still stood up for who you could, and that's what being a hero is all about, Aizawa said.
Izuku was silent. He had to be so that he didn't cry. He couldn't believe what he was hearing.
This was the first teacher that Izuku had ever had that believed he had a shot. Aizawa was the first to say that he could be a hero. Not even All Might, the man that Izuku had looked up to the most, had said it. Izuku breathed deeply, rooted to the spot.
Go home, kid.
You'll need the rest for tomorrow, Aizawa said, passing him.
Izuku shook himself out of his stupor.
He wiped his eyes, because even if he hadn't exactly shed tears, he'd still come close. While he walked over to the changing rooms, Izuku wondered if he could hope for the other teachers to be as understanding as Aizawa. Sure, he'd been a little rough at first, but Izuku could see that there was a man who wanted the kids put under his care to be the best they could be. He was just doing what he knew had worked before.
Izuku couldn't fault him for that.
Izuku entered the changing rooms and put his regular school uniform back on, before collecting his things and beginning to head back to the classroom to grab his syllabus on his way home. That plan was thrown off the rails, however, when he ran into a rake-thin form when rounding a corner. He looked up as he stumbled backward, taken by surprise when that skeletal form was shockingly solid. The person hadn't moved one bit, but Izuku, who had done some weight training, was pushed away. Looking up had the opposite effect of satisfying Izuku's curiosity, however, as he saw the slim, haunted face of All Might's true form.
He'd only seen it twice.
They'd been on a rooftop in the city the first time, after All Might had saved Izuku from a villain. The hero had run out of time and shifted back to his true form, a gaunt old man who couldn't hurt a fly, and that wasn't because he looked kind. He had almost no muscle mass at all. He'd gone on to explain to Izuku how he'd gotten hurt by a villain a few years back and had wasted away from the after effects of multiple surgeries to save his life, and that this was the end result. A shell of the man he used to be, with that shell only able to be All Might for a few hours a day. All Might had then gone on to answer Izuku's question, the reason they'd been up there. He'd broken Izuku's heart, telling him that he couldn't be a hero with the power he had. Izuku had stopped idolizing All Might so fervently after that. He still did, of course, but now it was like everyone else's praise, it was of the ideal, and not the man himself. The second time, he'd told Izuku his results on UA's entrance exam, then they'd gotten into an argument because of the whole rooftop fiasco. Izuku should have expected the guy to stick around his old school.
Midoriya. Funny running into you.
This must be your first day. All Might said, his tone taking on an artificial quality to it that made Izuku's skin crawl.
What do you want?
Izuku asked, keeping his own tone as neutral as possible.
Why do you assume I want something?
I was simply walking through my old school campus and, don't even pretend.
You're All Might. Why would you just be hanging out when you could be saving lives?
I wonder if it's because your time limit is, Izuku said, a small smirk appearing on his face.
All right, that's quite enough, young Midoriya.
I see your point, All Might said, his eyes darting around to see if there was anyone around to hear Izuku spill his secrets.
So, what do you want? Izuku asked again. To talk to you.
I oversaw your first impromptu class with Aizawa, All Might said in a serious voice.
Oh, what? Don't tell me you want me to use my quirk less, Izuku said.
He felt sick just thinking about it, and saying it made his neutral expression fall into a frown.
No. I wanted to congratulate you on your performance.
It takes precision to do the things you did. With your quirk, it would only be natural to simply bulldoze through obstacles and miss the finer details, All Might said, and Izuku felt his fists clench without making them.
Are you saying that I can be lazy with this power? Izuku asked, his voice shaking with his fists. No, not at all.
Letting your quirk simply work is just more likely to benefit you than it is to cause you harm or stress, that's all. All Might said, as if that was better. Izuku's hands, even though they were covered by gloves, felt sticky. A face, almost forgotten, left behind by the years that had passed, flashed in his mind. His kindergarten teacher, Nico, appeared to Izuku. The stickiness of his hands was precisely the way her blood had felt as it ran over his fingers, Nico's body crumbling into chunks before his very eyes. Izuku felt himself gag, and had to blink away the false image of red that took over his vision. He ran. Izuku simply ran. He didn't pick up a syllabus. He didn't stop to answer any questions as he raced past people in the halls, and he didn't stop to catch his breath, or let his tired legs rest, until he was far away from All Might. He must have decimated his gloves somewhere along the line, because the air that blew when he got outside to the front gate alleviated the itching he felt in them. He stopped for a short while, simply standing in the wind, letting himself be refreshed by it. Today had been hectic. First, he'd almost panicked in the classroom with Mineta, then he'd picked a fight with a teacher on the first day, then he'd almost gotten attacked by Bakugo as he'd showed off his power to everyone, and then had picked another fight with his teacher, but that part had sort of ended okay. All Might was a bummer for sure, and he didn't feel like he'd enjoy his time at UA very much if he knew that All Might was stalking the halls wanting to talk to him, but he could manage that. Everything else was a problem, though. This had not been a good first impression of UA, nor of Aizawa and his teaching style. It would get better, though. It had to, right? End of Arc 2. First impressions. I'm sorry to say, but there is no more of this fanfic right now, and I'll post more of the story if the author writes more, but hope you enjoyed it. Leave suggestions in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Peace out until next time. Hello and welcome to the channel. Hope you enjoy. This is What If Deku Had Decay Part 3 Chapter 8, New Horizons Summary. Izuku catches up with Uraraka a week after the exam, and comes to appreciate the effect that her enthusiasm is having on him. Notes, chapter text. Izuku walked down the street, picking at his gloves nervously. He'd picked up